because even though it is our Department of French which is hosting the program, translation is an area that concerns the other departments in the school. The Department of Modern Languages, the Department of English, and the Department of Linguistics. Scholars and professional translators, I believe that a conference such as this one provides a forum for the rich exchange of research ideas and experiences about the best practices in the field of translation studies in Africa. I wish to acknowledge Professor Daniel Ofori, Provost of the College of Humanities, University of Ghana, who is presiding over this opening ceremony, and Emeritus Professor Peter Flynn, who is scheduled to deliver the keynote speech this afternoon. It is also an honor to welcome our invited speakers and participants from several countries across the globe who are here for this conference. We have scholars from the African continent, from Angola, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, Togo, and of course, Ghana, as well as from Belgium, Brazil, Canada, and Germany. Welcome. During this conference, we will listen to about 30 presentations on various areas in translation studies, covering a broad spectrum of panel themes. Excuse me. I look forward to the different perspectives and cross-cultural exchanges that participants will bring to the discussions. I hope this conference will afford us the opportunity not only to listen to interesting, stimulating presentations and engage in fruitful deliberations, but also to build networks and forge collaborations that will fuel further forays into translation and its related fields. Once again, I welcome you all to the Second Association for Translation Studies in Africa Conference. Welcome to Ghana and to the University of Ghana, albeit across virtual space. I hope that this conference will be a memorable time for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ita. We are indeed humbled to have you join us, and we appreciate your warm wishes and welcome. Next, we have a musical interlude, and this will be given to us by a man who is an interpreter, but he is not only talented with words and language, but with music as well. He is the director of Can Translators, and that is the translation that is based in Kenya, and also the chair of East Africa Interpreters and Translators Association. Shall we welcome Mr. Alfred? Shall we welcome Mr. Alfred Imtawali?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I guess I'm going to do a song which is a very popular African song. And if you've been to Kenya, probably you've heard it at the airport or on Kenya Airways. But it's called Jambo Bwana. And in Swahili just means how are you, Mr. or Mrs. or Madam. And it says, In Africa, we have no matata. Everything is cool. So I will sing, and then at some point, I'll ask you to join. When I say Afrika bara zuri, you just say hakuna matata, just that. It's very easy, and I hope you will enjoy it. Jambo, jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana, wageni wakaribishwa bara la Afrika, hakuna matata. Jambo, jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana, wageni wakaribishwa bara la Afrika, hakuna matata. Jambo, jambo mama, habari gani? Nzuri sana, wageni wakaribishwa bara la Afrika, hakuna matata. Bara letu zuri, hakuna matata. Bara la Afrika, hakuna matata. Bara la pendeza, hakuna matata. Bara letu zuri, hakuna matata. Bara lina wanyama, hakuna matata. Bara lina milima, hakuna matata. Kuna Kilimanjaro, hakuna matata. Kuna Masai Mara, hakuna matata. Jambo, jambo bwana, habari gani? Nzuri sana, wageni wakaribishwa bara letu, hakuna matata. Jambo, jambo dada, habari gani? Nzuri sana, wageni wakaribishwa bara letu, hakuna matata. Bara linapendeza, hakuna matata. Bara lenye amani, hakuna matata. Bara la watafsiri, hakuna matata. Na pia wakalmani, hakuna matata. Hakuna matata, hakuna matata. Hakuna matata, hakuna matata. Hakuna matata, hakuna matata. Hakuna matata, hakuna matata. It just says Africa, beautiful continent. There's no matata, there's no problem. We have mountains, we have parks, we have great game reserves. Hakuna matata, and that's the Africa we belong to. Thank you very much, everyone.
That was splendid. Thank you so much, Mr. Alfred Mtawali. Indeed, Hakuna Matata. No worries. It's a beautiful day, and we are in the company of beautiful people. At this moment, we are moving on to a very important part of the program. Indeed, every part is important, and every person here is important. But for the for this occasion, we have with us somebody who is going to chair. And indeed, I do not have what it takes to introduce such a great personality. And so I will instead introduce or welcome the head of the French department, who is the mother of French in the University of Ghana, Dr. Sewenam Chachu, to introduce the chairperson.
Doc, please, you may have to activate your mic. You are still muted.
Sorry, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Pamela. So our chair for today is a project and applied management specialist, has considerable teaching, research and consulting experience in strategy and corporate social responsibility, project management, human resource management, and general management. He's currently a professor of management at the Department of Organization and HR Management at the University of Ghana Business School here in Accra. He teaches courses in CSR, project management, project evaluation, HRM, etc. at the postgraduate, which is master's and PhD levels. He's a 3-time head of the department, and he has managed and led research, consultancy, and governance assignments in the academic, public, NGO, and private sectors. He has served as a consultant for a wide range of clients, including the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Ministry of Lands, Forestry and Mines, Ministry of Communications, the World Bank, GTZ, GIZ, and UNICEF, among others. He's a consummate scholar and has published in several reputable outlets, including Thunderbird International Business Review, Library Review, Corporate Governance, African Journal of Business and Economic Research, among others. He serves on several boards and committees and is an external examiner nationally and internationally. He's a consultant with the National Accreditation Board, Ghana, and has served as an advisory board member of the University of Stellenbosch Business School Center for Business and Society. He has served as a coordinator for the University of Ghana PhD programs, has been the acting director of the University of Ghana's Academic Quality Assurance Unit, and is currently the provost of the College of Humanities, which oversees the School of Languages and, by extension, the Department of French. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you as chair, Professor Daniel Frimpong Ofori. Thank you very much. Prof, your audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chachu, for your glowing remarks. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I have the singular honor to chair this conference, and it's one that I am doing with a lot of pleasure, especially for someone who has studied French for many, many, many years, more than I care to remember, but who is still waiting to be able to string a comprehensible French sentence, even as I sit here today. If I were so fluent, I probably would have been doing this speech in French. But I haven't lost hope. I believe that in due course, I shall complete my B1, B2, C1, C2, and then be able to rub shoulders with our French community people on the campus. So let me deliver my speech so that we can get on the business of the conference. On behalf of the management of the University of Ghana and the university community, we would like to thank the Association for Translation Studies in Africa for choosing the University of Ghana to host this year's event. Even though this conference was to have been held in June 2020, it has had to be rescheduled because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We at the University of Ghana are delighted to be hosting this conference because we see it as an opportunity to unify African institutions towards a common good, supporting our well-known interest in interinstitutional collaboration. It is rather unfortunate that COVID-19 has denied us, at least for to be able to, the opportunity to show our beautiful campus, our Legon campus, and other interesting sites in Ghana to our foreign participants. As a university that believes in the power of languages, the University of Ghana's Master of Arts Translation and Master of Arts Conference Interpreting programs commenced in August 2003 and August 2012, and so have been running for almost 18 years and 9 years respectively. We have also recently introduced the Translation Studies option to our PhD French program. Through these programs, the University of Ghana hopes to contribute to training not only the next generation of translators and interpreters in Africa, but also theorists and researchers who will bring the African dimension to bear in translation studies as a research discipline. We are extremely proud to be members of the ATSA network. Undoubtedly, our membership has reaped enormous benefits for both staff and students of the University of Ghana in general, and in particular, provided added value to our programs. COVID-19 has taught the world that we can only build better if we build together. By collaborating, sharing expertise and research information, and finding lasting solutions together to the numerous problems confronting our world. It is our strongly held view that translators and interpreters can serve as the glue that binds our joint efforts. This conference could therefore not have come at a better time, as it serves as our opportunity to kickstart effective collaboration between our member institutions. The Association for Translation Studies in Africa's decision to hold this year's conference is therefore very timely. We support the decision and are eager to have interactive sessions that will stimulate our thoughts. We are convinced that this conference will result in decisions that will help shape the world and make it a better place. We thank the organizing committee of the University of Ghana's Department of French, the ATSA Secretariat, and all support staff for working tirelessly to ensure the success of this event. As we say in Ghana, Akwaba, to all our participants from within and beyond the continent. I wish you a wonderful conference week with fruitful discussions and great networking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Provost. We are so excited and pleased and honored to have you with us and to have you chair this opening ceremony. At this point, we will also like to hear from the association, which is actually the originator of this conference. We cannot move on without hearing from the Association for Translation Studies in Africa. And to hear from them, we will receive at this moment remarks from the ATSA President, Prof. Paul Bandia.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Greetings to everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Provost for his remarkable remarks. I would like to thank the Dean, as well as the head of the Department of French for their encouraging remarks and for their support of this initiative to hold ATSA 2021 in Ghana. Special thanks to the organizing committee for sparing no effort at all to bring this event to fruition. These are very difficult times, as we all know, with the global pandemic, And in spite of these difficulties, the organizing committee has worked relentlessly to make this event a reality. It would have been preferable, of course, to have an in-person meeting, which we were hoping for in 2020. But given the circumstances, we are very pleased to be meeting this year, virtually, of course, which has allowed ATSA to maintain its biannual conference schedule. As you all know, Africa is tailor-made for translation studies, given its varied cultures and multiple linguistic and rich linguistic landscape. It is encouraging to see how much interest there is in translation studies on the continent. Judging by the program for this event, one can say in all confidence and in hope that the future looks bright for translation studies in Africa. It is the responsibility of each one of us to continue to promote translation studies in Africa and to participate actively in ATSA. I do invite those of you who haven't done so yet to strive to become active members of this association, which is going to be quite relevant to bringing together the various parties interested in translation studies across the continent. We do need such an organization. It was high time we had something like that, and I'm very, very proud to be leading this association, which has as an agenda to encourage translation studies related to Africa. I would like to take this opportunity to wish all the delegates to this conference and summer school a very successful and rich experience at this event. I'm sure that we will all come out of this richer, better, and with a lot more enthusiasm, with a lot more interest in the field, and with the resolve to continue to promote translation studies in Africa. And above all, as president of the association, I would hope that we will all become full members, active members, paid up members, so that we can continue to promote and sustain this organization or this association, which indeed is setting the platform or the basis for encouraging studies in this wonderful, wonderful discipline across Africa. All right, so I thank you so much for being part of this, and thank you so much for making this possible. And thank you so much for all the effort that you've put into this to be able to realize this whole event online, which is certainly not an easy task. So thank you very much. And I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful conference and summer school. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Bandia. With such refreshing words, we will move on to our keynote speaker's address for today. And I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is none other than a professor who lectured in translation studies and English at KU Leuven, Antwerp campus from September 2006 until October 2020. He completed a PhD in language and literature, and it was awarded in January 2006 at Ghent University, where he worked as a lecturer at the English department from 1999 to 2006. The title of his dissertation, a linguistic ethnography of literary translation, Irish poems, and Dutch-speaking translators. And this comprises a linguistic ethnographic study of literary translation practices among translators in the Netherlands and Flanders, as well as a corpus study of English language, Irish poetry in Dutch translation. Prior to that, he worked as an English teacher and coordinator of language courses at the College of Europe in Brugge, from 1994 to 1999. He was also a self-employed professional translator during the same period and has continued to translate on a regular basis since. In cooperation with the Flemish poet Joris Even, he published an anthology of Irish poetry in Dutch translation in 2013. He has co-organized translation conferences and events on a yearly basis since 2007 and has published widely on translation and related topics. His main areas of interest: ethnographies of translation practices, empirical and functionalist approaches to translation studies, linguistic ethnography, literature, especially Irish literature, and sociolinguistics. He is a member of the CETRA teaching staff and a research fellow at UFS Bloemfontein, and continues to work as a guest lecturer in translation studies and as a freelance literary translator. Indeed, I'm sure you can tell from his profile that he is a man that we need to listen to. Shall we welcome Professor Peter Flynn? Professor Peter Flynn, you have the floor. Professor Peter Flynn, we cannot hear you. Could you kindly check on your sound? I apologize, we still cannot hear you. Okay, so as we try to sort that out, I would like for us to look at a few things as we are going to be speaking about translation and interpreting. Indeed, there's a number of things that happens in the industry, which gives some people a reason to laugh, and for others, it remains a painful or an experience they would rather not tell another day. Now, there was a case where a company wanted to translate a certain advertisement. And so they decided to do it on their own. And in so doing, their adverts came out with a very awkward translation. One which I believe... Oh, okay.
Yes, we could hear you.
Professor Peter Flynn, we can hear you now. Yes, you can speak. We can hear you now.
Hello.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Can you hear us?
We can hear you. It's a bit low, though. The volume is a bit low, but we can hear you.
Professor Flynn, can you hear us?
My God, I don't seem to be getting anywhere.
Okay, let me just...
Hello?
Hello, Professor Flynn.
Prof, we can hear you now.
We can hear, oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, God, what a relief. Loud and clear. Thank you very much. I Before I start to share my screen with you, I would like to thank you, all of you present, for the wonderful opportunity you gave me to participate in this conference and to be your keynote speaker. So, dear Dean, dear Provost, and dear Head of the French Department, dear members of the organizing committee, and dear ATSA members, and dear fellow participants, it's a great honor for me to speak to you today. And I hope I can provide you with some interesting ideas that will help us start a discussion afterwards. I have a PowerPoint which I would like to share with you. We can discuss things as we go along, or perhaps I'll just go through my PowerPoint first, and then we'll have a question and answer period afterwards, which is what is on the program. As a retired academic, I can now take more time and approach things from perhaps a more philosophical angle, if you like, and try and make connections that I didn't have really much time to do so because I was too busy teaching and lecturing and doing research in the past. So when I was asked to do this keynote, I thought, well, what can I talk about? And perhaps my favorite topic, of course, is ethnography. And I want to draw the connection between ethnography and translation. So my title is, what has ethnography got to do with translation? The musings of a retired academic on the warp and woof of language and culture. And here are the main points actually I would like to stress or underline. One is on where we are theorizing from. So no one theorizes in a vacuum and always gets his or her ideas from somewhere, and always have their own position on things. So it's important to be aware of this. Next, I would like to point and discuss the versatility of a couple of very old concepts, or rather old here I say, but they're, a couple of them are perhaps 100 years old and still going strong. Perhaps not enough in translation studies, but outside it, they are doing quite well. And this rather vague third point is the conceptual importance of being somewhere. So the importance of being somewhere that helps you develop ideas and engage with theory and practice in translation studies. Now, the first couple of concepts I'd like to talk to you about were posited by Friedrich Schleiermacher back in the early 19th century, actually, Verfremdung and Einbürgerung, which is German terms for terms that you are probably very, very well familiar with. These terms were first formulated at a lecture in 1813 on the different methods of translation delivered at the Berlin Academy of Sciences in June of 1813. Now, this lecture was actually taken up by the translation scholar André Lefebvre and translated from the German first in 1977. In turn, this was picked up by the famous Lawrence Venuti, who effectively became the champion of foreignization and domestication, as opposed to perhaps, and you could say, well, from there on, the rest is history. We all know about foreignization and domestication. But actually, history is precisely the point I would like to make here. Venuti's book on the invisibility of the translator and the discussion of the terms foreignization and domestication, set off a huge discussion, or a polemic, if you like, on the meaning of these terms. If you want to find out more about that, there's a nice little article in the Handbook of Translation Studies by Palapowski. But if you look at this actual text, you will see, and Schleiermacher's work in general, you can see that the polemic or the things that were talked about in the polemic were already there in Schleiermacher's work from the beginning. So it is interesting to do a bit of historical research when it comes to the translation studies concepts. And I can only recommend my colleague Lieven Dulf's work in that respect. So this was Schleiermacher's famous proposal, and then, of course, in English translation. Either the translator leaves the writer in peace as much as possible and moves the reader towards him, or he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the writer towards him. So, a couple of initial remarks on this. Domestication is actually a rather problematic translation of Einbürgerung to start with. It has quite a number of other connotations than domestication, which we tend to think about in terms of, well, pets or animals like horses or dogs or something, you know. So it's maybe it's not an apt term if you as a translation of Einbürgerung, but be that as it may, I think what is more problematic but not uncommon in translation studies is setting up dichotomies. So it's either or. Dichotomies tend to, and there's quite a lot of them around, and foreignization and domestication are two of them, or let's say they're one dichotomy. Dichotomies never really offer us much methodological leverage. You know, they tell us interesting things, but they don't allow us to discover, well, what is foreignization or what is domestication? It's simply a factor, whatever. But as Theo Hermans pointed out, the dichotomy that Schleiermacher was arguing for was actually not a real dichotomy at all. The second option, which was bringing the writer to the readers, he wasn't interested in at all, even though a lot of people are. And his own conviction was that we had to bring the audience as much as possible towards the writer. He believed of the principle of essential identity between thought and expression, and this conviction forms for him the basis for the entire art of understanding speech and thus of all translation as well. So that's the end of the quote from Theo Hermans' interesting chapter. You must remember that Schleiermacher's views on translation were part of his views on the theory of interpretation, or hermeneutics as it's known. And this is a few basic ideas from Schleiermacher's hermeneutics in a very interesting article by Forster. Hermeneutics, he says, is strictly the theory of understanding linguistic communication, as contrasted, not equated with explicating, applying, or translating it. And hermeneutics should be a universal discipline, so that applies equally to all subjects. So this is quite an ambitious program, if you like. So to oral as well as to written language, it says here, to modern texts as well as to ancient ones, to works in one's own language as to works in foreign languages, and so forth. Schleiermacher recognized the importance of oral translation and oral communication, but his real interest was in translating written works. So already at that time, he set up what you would call a kind of hierarchy between forms of translation, in which interpreting was of a lesser sort of translation than the translations of important works. So despite this recognition of the oral, all of this became very much a bookish affair and very much a matter of interpretation, because Schleiermacher's hermeneutics were seriously criticized by other scholars in hermeneutics later. But that's not our problem today. Our problem is thinking about translation and trying to think about it cogently. So it's no surprise actually that Lawrence Venuti found himself in such hot water if the whole debate about what foreignization is and what domestication is was already problematized back in the early 19th century. So it's interesting to go back there because there is a tendency to talk about foreignization as the most important thing in relation to translating literature from another culture in another language. But this is not all that obvious. And I'd just like to introduce a short anecdote here. As one of my students at the ATSA summer school, the PhD summer school in translation studies, came to me in desperation one day because she realized that the corpus she was analyzing, the translational corpus, didn't have much foreignization in it. And she said, but we all studied Venuti and we were all in favor of foreignization, and we can't find much of it in the corpus. So what can we do? Abandon the corpus? We said, no. What you need to do is to study the corpus, not be too bothered or worried about foreignization. Find out what's in there and find out if there is foreignization, why? Or why is there a dominance of domestication? These are real questions you can ask and not worry about, fulfilling some sort of agenda. The next step I want to take is a little bit further in time, so towards us, and this links up with hermeneutics or understanding, the theory of, and this is a book called The Meaning of Meaning by Ogden and Richards, which was first published in 1923. And this is related to another very important concept that actually was discovered by means of translation, and it's called context of situation. Now, I.A. Richards and Ogden asked the famous anthropologist Malinowski to write a supplementary essay to their book, The Meaning of Meaning, a study of the influence of language upon thought and the science of symbolism, which he obligingly did. And this is what I want to spend the next little while talking about, the importance of this concept. But before we get there, I'm sure there are a few literary theorists among us today. And I'd just like to remind the listeners that I.A. Richards is the same person who wrote Principles of Literary Criticism back in 1924, and who was at the cradle of what became known as New Criticism in the United States, and such notions as words on the page. And I think also was kind of instrumental in setting up what later would be called deconstruction by Derrida. But back then, Richards was more interested in the sociology of literature, if you like, than the actual words on the page. But that's only part of the story, of course. Now, here is a quote from Malinowski's supplement to the book. An ethnographer has to survey, or convey rather, the deep yet subtle difference of language and of the mental attitude which lies behind it and is expressed through it. Now, what if we do something here? We replace the word ethnographer by translator and say the translator has to convey the deep yet subtle difference of language. and of the mental attitude which lies behind it and is expressed through it. Now you can see this is very obviously very much part of the work that translation scholars and translators, translation teachers try to do. And this is just the opening quote from Malinowski's supplement to the book, in which he discusses this concept of context of situation, which is an important thing in understanding how translation happens. Now, to do so, he gives us a piece of data from his field work in Papua New Guinea, which you can see on the screen here. And he provides us with an interlinear gloss of what this is about. So we run front wood ourselves, we paddle in place, we turn, we see companion ours. He runs rear wood behind their sea arm below. So this looks like a rather straightforward piece of data, if you like, but actually Malinowski spends a full 7 pages discussing this excerpt. And this is one quote from what he says in those 7 full pages. All this shows the wide and complex considerations into which we are led by any attempt to give an adequate analysis of meaning instead of translating, of inserting simply an English word for a native one. We are faced by a long and not altogether simple process of describing wide fields of custom, of special psychology, and of tribal organization, which correspond to one term or another. We see that linguistic analysis inevitably leads us into the study of all subjects covered by ethnographic fieldwork. Now, this is a highly insightful quote, and is something that I think we can all understand and identify with. So here we get to the moment which at which he conceives of this context of situation. Again, it is equally clear from the meaning of the expression, we arrive near the village of our destination, literally we paddle in place, is determined only by taking it in the context of the whole utterance. This latter again becomes only intelligible when it is placed within its context of situation, if I may be allowed to coin an expression, which indicates, on the one hand, that the conception of context has to be broadened, and on the other, that the situation in which words are uttered can never be passed over as irrelevant to the linguistic expression. So this is highly interesting, because what he's doing here is what an awful lot of sociolinguists do. They talk about the context in which language is used. But here he's giving a name to this. He's calling it a context of situation. He continues and says, but the widened conception of context of situation yields more than that. It makes clear that difference in scope and method between the linguistics of dead and of living languages. The material on which almost all our linguistic study has been done so far belongs to dead languages. Now you have to remember that Malinowski is talking in a European context here, and he's mainly speaking of Greek and Latin, upon which philologists had spent a lot of time studying things and developed a set of concepts, linguistic concepts, to analyze them. It is present in the form of written documents, naturally isolated, torn out of any context of situation. So the importance of context of situation, even for written documents, is important. And I think this has been covered in more recent times by what is now known as the sociology of literature. So I think we can recall Schleiermacher here, who was very often doing translations, analyses of biblical texts. and developing concepts to analyze them. But we also can see the work of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, who in his study of practices in Algeria talks about what he calls philologism, and a term he borrows from Voloshinov, who wrote on the same topic, which is basically the same as what Malinowski was saying. So you can see the early 20th century, there's a lot of, or a growing interest in living languages rather than dead ones. We go on further, and this is another work by Malinowski, The Language of Magic and Gardening, which as a retired academic is of increased interest to me because I'm growing my own vegetables at the moment. In the Gold Gardens and Their Magic, he goes on to say that it is the insistent linking up of ethnographic description with linguistic analysis, which provides language with its cultural context and culture with its linguistic reinterpretation. Within this latter, we have continually striven to link up grammar with context of situation and with context of culture. Now, these are highly interesting concepts, which I think we can all relate to and understand. But strangely enough, these concepts seem to leave translation behind, as it were, and reappear elsewhere in the field of linguistics, where they were taken up by a student of Malinowski's, John Rupert Firth, who used the concept in linguistics in British studies. The person we know the most about in this respect, person who used these terms, context of situation and context of culture, was Halliday, who, finding no work in Great Britain, moved to Australia and set up what we now know as systemic functional linguistics. And Halliday considered language as a social semiotic system. But translation as such seems to have disappeared from view in relation to these two concepts, even though SFL has long since been used in numerous studies to analyze and further theorize translation. So, despite Malinowski's clear interest, translation is seldom explored theoretically in anthropology and attendant ethnographies to the same extent as it is in translation studies, though some important works do exist. And this is one of them worth looking at. Reflection on language and culture, including translation, is mainly dealt with within linguistic anthropology or linguistic ethnography. But translation is usually understood as a kind of metaphor for something else that is talked about in everyday statements like this one. Cultural translation, which is what ethnography is, never fully assimilates difference. In any attempt to interpret or explain another cultural subject, a surplus of difference always remains, partly created by the process of ethnographic communication itself. Now, doesn't this sound very familiar to us? Cultural translation. There's a whole debate about this on a forum on cultural translation in the journal Translation Studies, and this ran from 2009 until 2010. And here is a contribution to that debate and a response to it by Maria Tomasco, who was a keynote at Stellenbosch for ATSA, I believe. Here she says, many fields have been tempted to latch onto terms meaning translation as an ostensibly easy way out of their theoretical problems, not realizing how complex textual translation is and how many theoretical problems the subject brings with it. Ethnographers and anthropologists have already gone down that road and found it a dead end. Attempting to appropriate textual translation as a model for their own disciplines has not substantially illuminated their own processes, nor has it solved theoretical problems in their own domain. But the thing is, and the point I would like to make to you, and perhaps we can talk about this later, is that it was Malinowski's acute awareness and experience of how complex textual translation is that led him to such notions as context of situation and context of culture. He didn't get there by pondering on and debating about what cultural translation might mean or how to define it. And this links up with an argument I would like to make. The fact that these concepts grew out of lived experience and engagement with language used in cultural context, which in fact is the daily bread of translators, has given them, these concepts, a long lease of life, something that makes it worthwhile revisiting, I think, from a translation studies point of view. I think these concepts would have made arguments about what some people call purely linguistic translation redundant. And I wonder if there's ever such a thing as ever existed, purely linguistic translation. My next move is to the famous French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and his famous work, Le Sens Pratique. In fact, much like Malinowski, the whole of Bourdieu's conceptual apparatus, including habitus, capital, and so on, took shape during his ethnographic fieldwork in Algeria in the early 1960s. In his preface to Le Sens Pratique from 1980, he talks about how he had to let go of structuralism and its theoretical underpinnings as a result of his observations in the field. So he said, talked about how cultural practices were not merely the result of unconsciously obeying cultural norms, but were comme une stratégie de reproduction prenant son sens dans un système de stratégie engendré par l'habitus et orienté vers la réalisation de la même fonction sociale, comme le produit d'une recherche plus ou moins consciente de l'accumulation du capital symbolique. Excuse my French pronunciation, but here is the English of Richard Nice's translation. As a reproduction strategy, taking on its meaning in a system of strategies generated by the habitus and oriented towards realization of the same social function, as a product of a more or less conscious pursuit of the accumulation of symbolic capital. So these concepts have been used in a huge number of studies and translation studies. But I think it's interesting to point out here that the habitus that Bourdieu is talking about in relation to the people he studied in Algeria is a collective notion and not an individual one, which is more often the case in studies using Bourdieu's concepts in translation studies. Bourdieu also was concerned about the notion of cultural distance, which is something that is talked a lot about in translation studies because of the, particularly from a cultural studies perspective, the distance between cultures, the power differentials between them, and so on. And the difficulties involved in, and I think all translators realize this, getting down to the nitty-gritty of translating what something might mean in another language, knowing the contextual constraints that go along with it. But he has a very interesting way of thinking about this cultural distance. He says, to abolish distance, it's not a matter of fictitiously bringing the foreigner closer to the imaginary native, as we ordinarily do. So this is, you would call intuitionism. So you're trying to live the native experience. It is by distancing through objectification the native who is in each foreign observer that one brings him or her closer to the foreigner. So what he's saying is we should take distance from the native, our own native in us, in order to be able to understand the other native. I think this is a very original way of looking at it, and it's not something that has made its way into the discussions very often. If you want to find out more about Bourdieu, the ethnographer, I recommend a piece by Jan Blommaert in The Translator. So what I've been doing is a kind of history of concepts in a way, with a view to showing you that these concepts have a long lease of life, and they've been around and they might still be useful for us. But if you're interested in reading more systematic analyses and histories of these, I would recommend the following two books. First by Susan Sarajeva, Theories on the Move, Translation's Role in the Travels of Literary Theories. And this book by Schugler, Circulation of Academic Thought, Rethinking Translation in the Academic Field. So here we can see that translation, of course, plays a vital role in the circulation of ideas. So translators are to be thanked for that, of course. Now, I hope I'm not running out of time. I want to take you to a neighborhood in the city where I live and move out of the books and theories and visit a place which you can see in the picture here. Now, actually, this is the Rabat housing scheme in Ghent, and it's just beyond the inner ring road in Ghent city, and was built in the early years of the 60s to house people from a poor neighborhood. Now, this has been done, I think, all over the world. And now all of these projects are being torn down and replaced by more amenable places. But before they were, these housing schemes were the whole wave of migrants to Europe. A lot of people ended up in these housing schemes. So there was a huge multilingual community living in this housing scheme, as in other ones in and around Ghent. And it's something I'm sure you're familiar with in your own situations. But as I say, these houses, these flats have been torn down, and this was the first stage of the dismantlement of the housing scheme, where you can see that all the windows have been taken out. You can still see the different colors of wallpaper on the inside of each separate apartment. So a block of high-rise flats, and the concept in relation to which I would like to discuss is what's known as intralingual translation. The findings I would be drawing on to discuss this comprise in-depth interview with an artist and leader of a self-help project that was run in the housing scheme, documentation I acquired, recordings, and a book and documentary the self-help group issued as well. And what I'd like to point out in discussing this is this notion of social transience, because what was once a community in a sort of vertical village, as Le Corbusier used to call it, has now been displaced. The people who were living in this building are now living elsewhere and actually don't see each other very often anymore, which is unfortunate. Now I'm going to let you hear a piece of audio from one of the people living in this building. It's in Ghent dialect, and I will explain it to you later. I just hope that you can hear it.
De dokter van de tv. Het teken wel. Dat is van de dat is van de muziek die betalte, of even niet betalte. Dan ben je toch een mooie tafel te vragen. Dat is betaald van water.
Okay, I'd just like to go back to that again, if I may. So I'd just like to show you this. The speaker in this little short excerpt does not know how to read. He never learned how to read correctly, but he didn't know how to count. So that means that he could not read anything, correspondence he got through his letterbox. But he did develop his own little sign system, which you can see illustrated here on the envelope. You can see a crude drawing of a television with an aerial. You can see the 7 days of the week with the horizontal bar going through it, which means morning, afternoon. And very rudimentary letters like T for television and J, which is the Dutch word for ja, which means yes, which means with the circumflex on the top of the day, which means that the bill has been paid on that day. So this system he uses is quite interesting. And I will come back to it as we go along. The other data I will draw on here is from a long narrative on translation in the building with the person who was running the self-help group. Is mention of this idea of what he called textual poverty, which I'll go into, and also on the system of exchanges in the building. So how people living in the building used to look after each other in all sorts of ways. Now, the data I'm using for this was actually all in Dutch or in Ghent dialect, which had to be translated into English, which I think is something that you're all very well familiar with, and something that is rather ironic, I think, that the language of translation studies is English. And we all know that English speakers are notoriously monolingual, which is rather interesting. Now, the main lines of this narrative from the interview was this. The flat dwellers used to meet at the letterboxes in the hall when the postman arrives. The letters were either brought to a person's flat or were opened there and read and translated on the spot by the neighbors. So what we have here is ad hoc translation and interpreting. So the translator would tell the dwellers in their dialect what a given letter is about and what course of action to take. So how can we understand this from a translation studies point of view? Okay, it's interlingual translation. Now, interlingual translation was posited by Roman Jakobsen back in 1959. And this is how he defined it. He said interlingual translation or rewording is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of other verbal signs in the same language. So what we have in this instance is written standard Dutch in the letter, which is reworded in oral Ghent dialect and then translated into F's own sign system. So you have various stages of translation going on here. So you could ask yourself, what are the source texts involved? You could say, well, a gas or an electricity bill, letter from the police, insurance company, or other forms of official discourse written in standard Dutch. And the target text is a set of instructions in K's sign system, which were mediated orally through the local interpreter. I've always wondered if André Lefebvre, when he posited the notion of rewriting, if he wasn't inspired by the notion of rewording, posited by Jacobson. So the medium involved, we've got spoken interpretation of written discourse back to written translation in a new sign system. And all of this is hidden in trilingual translation in the multilingual context of the housing scheme. So resources, in this case, language resources, are important aspects of context here. And I'd like to quote Jan Blommaert on this. Resources and the way in which they feature as elements of a social structure are often invisible contexts in discourse analysis. Illiterates will not show up in analyses of written discourse. Their perceptions of news and politics do not feature in analyses of newspaper reporting. Such analyses are not about nor for them. So this is important, I think, Jan Blommaert drawing our attention to the marginalized in our societies. What we also know about this interlingual translation is that it is interdependent with other practices. So it belongs to the local economy of exchanges in the building. So there are connections between the formats of text presentation and the types of interlingual translation used. So if some people have no access to these formats, they are textually poor. So there is textual poverty in the building. So intralingual translation between dialects and sociolects, which means that there are literacy issues here. There's a lack of access to standard language, in this case, standard Dutch, among the residents. And there's intralingual translation between different registers. So official discourse to non-official, in this case, or that sort of thing. And this is often studied in intralingual translation as expert to lay translation and interpreting. But we have, obviously here, unequal social distribution of repertoires. Karen Zetson pointed to what she calls the four pertinent aspects of intralingual translation as being knowledge, time, culture, and space. So in the context of Rabot, knowledge or gaining access to knowledge through translation can be critical. If you don't know what the letter in your letterbox is about, yes, well, you have a problem. And time, the second aspect that she talks about, after or upon gaining knowledge. This also means time span or degree of urgency in paying bills, keeping appointments with social services, the police, staying out of debt. So time is a kind of more, not just an abstract thing, it's a sense of urgency as well. Culture is also important. Access to or unequal distribution of, resulting in marginalization of residents. So the people living in the building are not aware of certain cultural things that other people might be. But then of course space, which we usually talk about in intralingual translation as the space on the page. But this is also the space in the building, the signs in the building, and so on. And the relation between that and textual practices. So that the ad hoc translators and interpreters have to be brief and simplify things to make them accessible to some people. So what we see here is not some sort of abstract idea of rewording, but the context-specific purposes and meanings of rewording, also in relation to these four factors. Added to this, we have to understand that the people working or living in this building, there's a tacit agreement or understanding among them. And it was about about the purpose of these communicative events at the letterboxes in the morning. It was always about some form of compensation and equal redistribution of the goods they had at some stage, but it was never mentioned. So if an interpreter did some work for F that was, consistent or, on a regular basis, F would be expected to do something in return. So there would be odd jobs to do, repairs, doing errands for people, or other people might be asked to lend some money, that sort of thing. So this is all part of the exchange, the economy of exchanges in the building. And the head of the group said that they were amazingly democratic in this. Everybody had to get the equal amount of whatever was going down, or everyone had to do something in return for anything that was done. So this is, had developed as a cultural practice in the building, which is something remarkable, I think. So this allowed me, as a humble member of the theoretical community, if you like, to contextualize what Roman Jakobson meant by rewording an intralingual translation, and to theorize a little further on it. So I came up with this notion of placing translation. So placing the English word in terms of to remember something or to understand it. Oh yes, I can place it or I can't place it. So this involves trying to find and understand translation, which is often sometimes visible in social contexts in which it takes place. And it also means understanding the nature of the economy of exchanges involved in such cases. And I believe, and I think you would agree with me, that these are everyday practices happening where you are. So I'd like to draw the attention here to the difference between placing and citing, which is a term proposed by Niranjana in her 1992 book. So this brings me to my concluding assertion. Being somewhere, whether you're in Papua New Guinea or in Algeria, or even in another neighborhood in your own town, this idea of being somewhere or being somewhere else is something that translators and ethnographers share as a point of departure. You might even call it a state of mind. I would like to thank you all for listening to me. And of course, I can provide all the bibliographic references that are needed that I drew on for this talk. So thank you very much. And I hope this was useful to you and that it will provide reason for discussion and debate. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Peter Flynn. And that was an enlightening speech and enlightening topic. At this moment, we'd like to take any questions that may come for our speaker, what he has presented thus far. So if you have a question, you may kindly raise your hand. Or you can simply request to speak. Unmute yourself and request to speak. So do we have any questions on the floor?
Amala, this is Kubis Marais. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Hello, Peter. How are you? Peter, can you hear me? Pamela, I'll type my question. It seems that Peter cannot hear me, so I'll type my question, then maybe you can just read it for him.
Okay. Okay, indeed, he cannot hear us. So you may type your question, and in that case, I'm sure he would read it. I'll read it for the audience as well. And then he can also read and provide an answer.
Okay, I'll try to type it now. I'm going to send it to you. My mailbox doesn't want, my chat box doesn't want to send messages to all, so I will send it to you.
That's all right. Okay. So we saw an interesting concept about intra-translation. And I believe there was this notion about written text being orally translated, and then the response being given via another form of translation, that is, well, a sign language text. And I am wondering whether this is something that other people have noticed in their cultures, and if this is something that anybody has experienced and would like to share with us. Okay, so the question from Professor Kobus Maris is, what do we lose if we don't study everyday translation? So what do we lose if we don't study everyday translation? What do we lose if we don't study everyday translation? So this is a question for the speaker and for everybody else as well. What do we lose if we don't study everyday translation? Okay. I saw some other hands up. I saw another hand up. Is there anyone else?
Can you hear me, Pamela?
Yes,
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
The question is, what do you lose if you don't study everyday translation? Nothing. I think all translation is everyday translation. The sense that what I was trying to show you by pointing this out is that translation is everywhere. It's part and parcel of everything we do. It's not just hidden in books. I think it's important to realize that you can find it everywhere you look, wherever you go. And so I think this is an encouraging thing. And it's just when you keep your eyes and ears open as you go around, and you can hear it on public transport or wherever you go, in the markets and in the shops, you realize that what you're doing as a translator is vitally important. So you belong to a global community in a way. I don't know who asked that question, but does that answer the question?
Yes, so that was from Professor Kobus Marais. And we have another question. We have another question from...
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kobus, for that question. I think, if I may add something to that, it's and what I was trying to do in the whole talk actually is this sort of the state of mind I'm talking about, that allows us to bring together the lived and the bookish, if you like, the theoretical, that gives more depth to the way we think about things.
Okay, so we have another question.
So I'm open to all the questions you want to ask. We still have time, I believe.
Indeed. We have another question from Damola. I don't know if I have the name right.
Yes, hello.
Yes, please.
Thank you for the privilege. Well, I would have loved to add to the question when we say, what do we do? What we lose when we don't study translation? It's as good as asking that what we lose when we don't study music. Everybody sings, but not everybody can sing with notes. Everybody can, well, people can translate on the street, people can translate in the market. My great-grandmother can translate or interpret from one language to the other. But there are a lot of the intricate aspects of translation or interpretation that you may not know. So when we say what we lose when we don't study translation, it's as what we lose when we don't do a systematic study of songs. For instance, what are the components of that songs? What has brought
That's true
what we
enough.
are calling songs? Thank you. Hello?
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Mr. Or is that Professor Damola? So thank you for that.
This is from Dalola. Yes, very much. I agree very much that translation is intricate and so needs a systematic study. And I think that's what I was trying to point out, these notions of context of situation and context of culture draw our attention to that complexity and allow us to think about, like, well, which context are we dealing with here? Which culture are we dealing with? What are these intricacies, and how do we go about understanding them and developing conceptual tools to understand them even better? So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Pamela, I have a question, but I'm not finding the hand to raise the hand. I'm not finding the feature. All right. This is Paul Bandia. I just want to thank you for a very, very interesting talk. Very wonderful indeed. Again,
if I may add something more to that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, like, because of what is called a cultural turn in translation studies, people moved away from linguistics altogether. And which I find a bit unfortunate, because I think we need both. We need culture and language study, and they should be brought together.
Well, that's can I go on, Pamela?
Yes, please.
All right. Yes, Dr. Flynn, Professor Flynn, I'm so glad to have heard this lecture. It was very informing. And what I liked about it, again, is that, I mean, it kind of makes me a bit dated, but it reminds me of my graduate studies for my master's and PhDs. We had to go through
a lot of able to see if there is a hand raised.
Yeah, I just looked and I didn't know how to raise the hand, but can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes, good. All right, then.
All right. Informative.
Very good. I found it really great. Honestly, again, it took me on some kind of a wonderful trip. You know, in my graduate studies days, we did a lot of that because I was in the linguistics department studying translation studies, doing translation studies, and we did a lot of studies in linguistic anthropology, which again provided me the basis for what I've been doing ever since. And I think it's pretty interesting. And I'm also very happy with your last remark that it is rather unfortunate that with the cultural turn in translation in the 90s, there seems to be this impression that, it's over for linguistics. No, linguistics is not as interesting, but there is no way I can imagine anyone studying translation without some.
No more questions?
Yeah. Are you listening? Are you hearing me, Dr. Flynn?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. There's no way you can study translation studies, do translation studies without any particular specific reference to linguistics. So the cultural turn has been good for integrating cultural issues and looking beyond translation scholarship to enrich our field. But I'm not sure it is feasible at all to be able to dissociate cultural studies and linguistics in the context of translation studies. They go hand in hand. That said, my question has to do with something that I've been wondering about.
Perhaps people could, if they want to ask a question, they could turn on their microphone briefly.
My microphone is on, actually. My microphone is on, but my video is off. Anyways, I'm going to ask this question, probably Pamela, I can summarize it for you. The question is this, it's very simple, mostly for pedagogical reasons. There is this thing about the domestication and foreignizing, which is brought up quite often and has had a great deal of influence in translation research, particularly amongst graduate students. When I attend conferences in Europe, it's always the two. It's almost like the basic theory of translation, the basic principles of translation. I'm glad that you brought that up. But what I would like to say is that I'm not sure if we are familiar with the fact that ever since Venuti himself has stated a more nuanced position in this regard, a nuanced position with respect to domestication and foreignization. In other words, it is not necessarily always entirely domesticating or always entirely foreignizing. The two work hand in hand. And it is fair to say that Venuti's position has been revised by him initially and has been taken up by other people working with cultures that are usually described as minority cultures.
That's a very interesting question from Akunga. I think multimodality is important thing here because, well, in analyzing any sort of real-time meaning or interaction, we will automatically be looking at gestures and facial expressions and all of the things, pointing and so on. That is required to get a full understanding of what's happening. And I think, the tools that are available now in terms of, multimodality are the,
I'm sorry, Professor Flynn. I think we've lost you.
I think
yes.
Prof. Flynn was muted. Someone was muted accidentally.
Okay.
Yeah, I say that they do work hand in hand, but the problem is younger students fail to see that. And in fact, you can find both foreignization and domestication in the same translation. But people tend to think in terms of binaries, they have a tendency to think it's either or. And that's, I think, problematic. So I think young students should be told this from the very beginning. Because even PhD students have a tendency to think in terms of binaries as being mutually exclusive.
Thank you very much, Professor Flynn. I would like to entreat everybody that we seem to be having a technical issue with the sound. So could you kindly type your question in the chat? Please make sure you are responding to everyone when you do so.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we have a question from Paul Bandia. For the interest of the French department, could you say a few words about why Antoine Berman is often omitted in the domestication versus foreignization debate? Okay. So
Okay, from the question from the French department.
Not from
Yes.
Paul.
Yes, I find that rather sad, and I'm sorry I didn't mention him actually, because Berman on the whole is left out of almost everything. Is a very important French scholar, and unfortunately, a lot of people in the English-speaking world are not aware of his work. But I just wanted to, because of the link between André Lefebvre and Venuti to Schleiermacher, I wanted to point that out. And I also, with a view to sort of presenting a warning about not getting caught in dichotomies. But a point taken about Antoine Berman. I apologize for not including him in the debate.
okay, so earlier on, Professor Flynn responded to two questions.
The thing about Berman is he was a very dedicated translator as well. And a lot of his ideas come out of his very close engagement with translation practice. And I don't think Lawrence Venuti had the same sense of dedication as Antoine Berman as a translator. But who am I to say so? Maybe I'm mistaken.
Indeed. Okay, so we had two questions.
I hope that answers the question from the French department.
We had two questions which have been answered already. In the meantime, I'll read it out just for the benefit of everybody, in case somebody else has something to contribute on those questions. The first question was on whether, since Venuti has brought a more nuanced view, the issue about the issue is not is no longer binary. It seems to work hand in hand, and Professor Peter Flynn responded to that. And the next question was from Paul Bandia, and the next question from Akunga Onyangeri. Does ethnography solve the complexity of real-time meaning, or a multimodal approach is necessary? And according to Prof. Flynn, he thought a multimodal approach is necessary. Okay. So do we have any more questions or contributions from the floor?
Luke's hand is up.
Okay, before that, I see that there's a question in the chat box. Can a translator work and provide a perfect rendering without any other one approving?
The student from Ghana Institute of Languages. A very interesting question. Thank you for that question. I think it's important for us as translators to work together, and actually modern translation companies have revisers. Sometimes the revisers do nothing else than revision work. So I think it's also, from a professional point of view, it's important to engage with feedback, because otherwise you may get stuck in quirks and favorite things to do and miss aspects of what you're doing. or what you're translating. So I think it's impossible to give a perfect rendition without someone else's approval. And actually, things have gone majorly wrong in this case, in a very famous case, actually, which I could tell you about now. The Irish Nobel Prize winner of literature, Seamus Heaney, one of his books of poetry was translated into Dutch. And no one got to see the translation except the translator. And the thing was published and then put in this on sale in the bookshops. And then the literary critics in the newspapers and elsewhere began to read this translation and began to discover serious flaws in it. So the publishing company ended up pulling the book from all the shops and having the book retranslated, which was a huge, economic disaster for the company. And also it ruined the translator's reputation. So I think it's our professional duty as translators never to put ourselves above the law in a way, and always be open to feedback from our peers or from our teachers, because only in that way can we grow. It takes this, and it's never ending. We translators are always learning. And this is the state of mind I think, I was trying to get at. It's something that you have to keep, you have to train it sort of, because everywhere you go, you learn new things about a language or some way of saying something that you hadn't known before. And this is, here I am pleased to say I'm 66 years old and I'm still learning. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, indeed, Professor Flynn. And we have another question from Abdul Karim.
The question about domestication and localization. Yes, there's a very strong link between these two things. Localization is a term that comes out of computer website design and all of this. And actually, it's an attempt to avoid using the word translation. So when you localize something, you make it available for the local market in terms used and understood by locals. So yeah, but actually what it is a type of translation, a type of domestication translation. So yeah, I think indeed localization is perhaps a more profitable way of making money, talking about localization and talking about domestication and translation. But they are definitely linked, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Flynn. I do not see any more questions or any more hands. Okay, one more hand up. Two, okay.
Any more questions?
I will give the floor, yes, I will give the floor to Ebenezer, first of all, to give his question.
Okay. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I would like to thank Prof for this very...
And
Yes, I would like to thank. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
can. Prof hear me? Okay, good. So I want to thank Prof for this very insightful presentation. And I'll make more of a comment than really ask a question, because it is interesting to hear about the trajectory of concepts in translation studies, but in this case, I would say in the Western world. And I think this is food for thought for us, because translation studies being the young discipline that it is in Africa, it will be interesting in our own situation, or maybe if I want to use the terminology of the day, in the context of our situation, to know how the same concepts have been traveling this way. Because I want to believe that as we are getting involved in translation studies, these concepts are traveling differently. The way and the challenges you face when you want to foreignize or domesticate.
From the Ghana student, or the Ghana Institute of Languages student. Which question, Pamela?
Right. Okay, so I believe Mr. Ebenezer was given a question, please.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, hello? We can hear you. We can hear you.
We can perfectly hear you. Hello?
Yes. This is the question from remark from Ebenezer. Okay. I think this is a very interesting question. And I think it's very important to develop. Okay, you can always draw on concepts that you will find in publications that come from the United States or from Europe. But I think it's important nonetheless to try and develop or adapt even your own concepts to the cultural practices that you are observing. I think rather than slavishly following these concepts, you need this kind of lived experience is something that I was trying to say in my talk, that the things that you observe around you and the things you read, bringing these two things together and adapting the concepts in that way so that they have a firm rooting in the cultures that you're studying. This is, I think it's important. So if you say it is a young discipline in Africa, you know what? Probably that's not true. Maybe as an academic discipline in the sense of translation studies, which is a fairly recent development in the world anyway. But I think if you start looking into the history of your of translation in your own country, you will find that it goes back centuries. And you will also find that people have been talking about it as such. So this is the my colleague Lieven Dulst has always been pushing this idea that translation is as old as the world. It's always been around. So I think it would be interesting from an African perspective to dig into that history and see how what people have been saying, over the centuries, and what the views on translation are locally. So
okay, thank you. On this question about whether a translator can work and provide
this question.
without any other person approving. I think Professor Flynn responded to that and even gave an example of a book that was translated and later on found to have a lot of errors in them. And so that book had to be withdrawn. So the answer would be no.
The question, okay, I can see your screen. Yeah, I told the story about Seamus Heaney's book, but I don't know if you can still hear me now. I've lost the chat.
Yes, we can.
Okay. What I was saying about the perfect rendering without any other one approval, I don't think this is possible. We need each other, and I've said this, already the last time, that for the person who couldn't hear this. Most modern translation agencies have a reviser. Or what very often happens is, if you're working on your own, you will send your work to someone else and they will send their work to you, so that there is always a cross check, so that we know. And I think this is very important professionally, that you develop this idea, and you keep questioning your ability. You should always, think, I can do better, and learn more. As I said, I'm 66 and I'm still learning. So I hope this, I can give a much longer talk about, but I don't know if I still have enough time left. About the tracing the concepts in Africa, I think that would be a wonderful project. I'm sure Professor Murray would be very happy to supervise a project like that. Because, as I said, like in my own case, the translation in the building I was talking about is invisible. A lot of these things are invisible, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. It's not because somebody's shouting at the top of his lungs that someone else, that he's right, or the only person talking. Sometimes things are there, and it's our job as translation scholars to find them. And then we have Abdul Wahid asking a question about universally accepted ethics of translation. Unfortunately, there is not. Even having an ethics of interpreting in courts in Belgium is a problem.
Allô?
Different courts, some courts don't even
Bonjour,
have
vous êtes tous connectés?
interpreting. So I think it's nice to think about a universally common or accepted ethics of translation. And perhaps it's our duty as translation scholars to discuss this in more detail and try and set up a kind of charter, if you like. But I think in that respect, it's early days. I think that there's still an awful lot of work to be done in relation to this. But it's a noble goal and something worth thinking about, Jess.
Thank you very much, Prof. Lynn.
See, Ebenezer's hand is up. I don't know, Pamela, if I'm taking up too much time, or whether, it's time to move on to the next speaker. Of course, I am always willing to answer these questions if people send me an email. I'd be most willing to answer questions through the email.
Thank you, Professor Flynn. I believe that at this moment we can take a short break And if there are any other questions, it would be forwarded to Professor Flynn by email, and we will present the responses. I'm sure he would be happy to respond and give more in-depth answers to all your questions via email, possibly with references, of course. So we would like to
Still have a
take
bit of time left, I think. Good.
and when we come
What should
back,
we do, Pamela? You're doing a great job.
so we will take a short break right now, and when
Thank
we
you very much, Paul. It's very much appreciated.
when we come back, we will move on with the program. So I will